Gender and sexuality. So before we begin this lecture, I think it's important that we have the clear definitions of sex and gender. So sex is the biologically determined category. So sex is going to be dealing with physical features, anatomy, as well as genetics. Gender, though, is the culture constructed category of like feminine and masculine. It's important that sex, when we talk about sex, it does not equal gender. So somebody could be anatomically a woman, but she may not be female. And as well as a person may identify as female, but not be genetically or biologically um, female bodied. So again, don't equate the two. Often it is equated together as sex equals gender and gender equals sex, but in fact they're very separate categories. So let's talk about sex. Sex is dealing with the genetics, the physical features. And it deals also with this thing called sexual dimorphism, which is the differences in between male and female biology. It's also really important that we talk about sex that there's a wide amount of variation within the human population. And what's interesting to know that as much as we talk about the differences between sex, women, and men, in fact, no one is actually 100% genetically or biologically female or male. In fact, there's a lot of variation in that. So when we talk about sex, we need to also recognize that there's incredible amount of variety within the human species. We're going to be focusing most of our lecture on gender. So gender is the range of physical, biological, mental, and behavioral characteristics pertaining to and differentiating between masculinity and femininity. It's very culturally specific, meaning that what considers as a masculine behavior or physical feature is very different depending upon the culture. It also changes through time. Like, even if we think about our grandparents' generation, what it meant to be feminine and what it meant to be masculine is probably very different from what we feel about it today in our sort of popular culture. Again, don't equate sex with gender, but also don't equate sexuality with gender. And that's really important, that we don't want to sort of think that because someone identifies as feminine, that she is attracted to men, or that someone identifies as masculine, that they're attracted to females. Sexuality is a different component that is outside of gender. But other factors about gender that really impact our lives are gender roles. So these are the tasks, activities, and behavior a culture assigns by gender. And gender roles are also informed by and help to inform gender stereotypes. So it's the oversimplified but strongly held ideas about the characteristics of male and female. So if you see the little picture up on top, girls are supposed to play with certain boy toys, boys are supposed to play with certain girl toys, and as you see in the picture, it's a mixing up of the two. Also, pink is girl, blue is boy, right? And I think that's really defines Western society, especially North America, is a gender binary, meaning that, and we'll be talking about this in the later parts of the presentation, is that we kind of live in a two-gender system, meaning that it's either male or female. Whereas in many other cultures around the world, there can be a third gender or a fourth gender that's neither male or female, but something else. But here in the United States, it's very much defined as male or female. And that can pose a lot of difficulties and hardships on individuals who don't identify with either or who want to identify with with the gender that they were not assigned to at birth. So again, the gender binary is something that's very prominent in Western society and can cause a lot of difficulties for individuals who don't necessarily fall within that binary. Another factor is gender stratification. So gender stratification describes the unequal distribution of rewards and benefits between genders, reflecting different positions in the social hierarchy. We recognize that there are globally some common patterns in how cultures work between women and men, meaning that there is a division in work. Usually, women are assigned to certain tasks and men are assigned to certain tasks. But the degree of gender stratification is very different. So even though there might be a different difference in sort of labor or benefits between the genders, there's a huge amount of variation between cultures. So when we're looking at a particular culture and we're trying to determine if there's, well, not only if there's gender stratification, but also how does this gender stratification works, anthropologists commonly consider the following, which is how much importance a culture places on women relative to men, and vice versa. How much power and authority is delegated between women and men, and the differences in power and authority. And lastly, what kinds of rights and responsibilities do women and men possess, and what are the differences between them? And when we're talking about power and authority, we're really talking about gender power. So what is gender power? So you remember in a couple classes back, we talked about power is the ability to exercise one's will over others, right? At the most simplest definition, that's what power is. But power doesn't live in a vacuum, meaning that, when we wield power, it really depends on the type of the social situation we are in, particularly how we can wield power and how much power can we wield. Really depends on a lot of factors. First of all, is our gender. I think that it's still pretty much common to say that women wield less power than men. Women are in a less authoritarian position than men. And that really sort of speaks to how power is very gendered, meaning that power is divided often unequally between genders. So when we talk about power in its sort of the way that people yield power, whether that's yourself or whether that's your politicians, there's a gender component in it, right? And you look at even politicians in the United States, and we see that usually it's male bodies who are white, usually middle class, and are not disabled in any way that can wield the utmost of power. But there are systems around the world that don't have this sort of inequality or have power differently gendered. So in a matriarchy, and many sort of Native American communities were matriarchal prior to colonization, which is a political system in which women play a much more prominent role than men in the social and political organization. So women were sort of the leaders and the sort of the decision makers. Whereas in a patriarchy, which defines pretty much the United States, it's a political system ruled mostly by men in which women have an inferior social and political status. And as much as we have gained an incredible amount of strides in the equality between genders, there's still a power differential between the two, meaning that men hold more power than women. But I took a picture of the Navajo Native Americans because the Navajo were traditionally a matriarchal society. Unfortunately, because of colonization, colonists, so European colonialists and then eventually American colonists, really tried to enforce their gender roles on Navajo people, making it so that Navajo women were seen as in an inferior position. And that's caused a lot of pain on Navajo Native Americans. But through the years, as they fought to regain their cultural and territorial rights, women have become very prominent and outspoken activists within the Navajo community and internationally as well. So let's go now on to gender identity. So, gender identity refers to whether a person feels and is regarded by others as male, female, or something else. And we'll get onto or something else in just a minute. Um, Gender identity is something that is learned. It's a socially constructed category. Gender is not genetic. Again, we can equate sex with gender. It's something that we are learned, right? As children, we learn to perform our gender roles, such as the simplest thing of if you go to a Disney store, you have the princess section, right? And that's for little girls. And then you have, I don't know, the comic book Marvel characters, that's for the little boys. And in those two, within the same store, there are two different sort of ways of teaching children about their gender identity, which is whether it's a princess, so femininity and beauty, to whether it's toughness and bravery within the Marvel action heroes in the boy section. So it's a behavior. And it's important to realize that because it is a learned behavior, it's not something that's predetermined, meaning that just because myself, I was born physically a woman, doesn't mean that my gender identity is naturally going to be a woman. In fact, biology is not destiny. People construct their own identities in society, and for many individuals, they construct their own gender identity. And this goes into transgender. Transgender is a large umbrella term, and in fact, there's a lot of definitions under this umbrella of transgender for people. How do they describe themselves? But for the most part, transgender represents people whose gender identity contradicts their biological sex at birth, and the gender identity that the society and them in infancy. Again, it's a broad term, and it's a term that can have a lot of variation. Meaning that I think that in Western society, luckily we're seeing more sort of public visibility of transgender individuals, but it's also important to know that just because we're seeing amazing people like Lana Wachowski, one of the directors of The Matrix, to Chaz Bono, to Laverne Cox, who's on Orange is the New Black, that yes, these are all transgender individuals, but there's also a lot more variation even with that. So it's great to see them, but know that they don't represent everyone under the transgender umbrella. It's also really important, and we're going to get into this next, is that transgender is a Western identity category, meaning that it's been created in North America and North Europe, that individuals who define themselves as transgender created this term for themselves or adopted this term for themselves. But it's an identity category that is not universally accepted, and you need to have caution when you're kind of trying to assign different identity categories onto individuals, to not sort of assume that because maybe someone doesn't identify with their biological sex, that they're transgender. In fact, it could be that they don't identify with their biological sex, but they have a culturally specific term for who they are, and you need to respect that. And that goes into sort of the thing of third gender, because there are many communities around the world that have a third or fourth gender category. And it's not meaning that they're transgender, because these third or fourth gender category has a very culturally specific meaning. So it's not that they would really recognize themselves under the transgender label, because they have a culturally sort of specific meaning to who they are. It's also important when we talk about third gender or even transgender that it's not about sexuality. It's about gender. So it's about people identifying with a gender outside biological sex. And it's not about their sexual orientation. So a great example that is in the United States are two-spirits. So many Native American cultures, there's a recognition of a third or sometimes fourth gender. For First Nation and Native American communities in the United States and Canada, a two-spirit is someone who, although biologically male or female, chooses to adapt sort of the similarities as well as the roles of a member of the opposite sex, so whether male or female. And a lot of times they're creating kind of their own unique role in the community. They may take on the traditional roles of a woman or a man. They may also be a wife or a wife to another man or a husband to another woman. They may also raise children. Two-spirit persons generally hold a very special place in many North American indigenous communities. They are often spiritual leaders, shamans, and are at the heart of cultural traditions within these communities. Now, it's important again that when we talk about two-spirit persons that we're not talking about sexual orientations, even though these may be biologically male men having sexual relationships with other biologically male men. Again, it's about gender because these men don't identify with the biological sex that they're born with. So two-spirit persons are not homosexual, and they also don't identify with the sort of Western term of transgender or transsexual because it doesn't encompass that sort of cultural meaning behind that role, specifically the important position that a two-spirit person has in many Native American communities as a spiritual leader. And it's also important to know that for generations, because of colonization, two-spirit persons were heavily persecuted by settlers and the American Canadian states. But luckily, and it's very inspiring that today there's a really rich movement by two spirits to raise their public awareness and to protect Native American rights. So let's talk about sexual orientation. It refers to the person's sexual attraction to and habitual sexual activities with persons with another person, whether that's the person of the opposite sex, so what we would call heterosexuality, persons of the opposite sex, so homosexuality, the same sex, homosexuality, or both sexes, bisexual, or neither sex, asexuality. Sexual orientation is an identity category, and it's important to differentiate that from sexual acts. That sexual orientation, whether you're gay, bisexual, lesbian, it's an identity category, and that the meanings behind sexual orientation are very culturally specific, and they have changed through time. So let's talk about sexual behavior or acts. So sexual activity is the sex act or the sexual behavior. So this is literally the act itself. So we're not talking about identity. We're talking just about the act itself. And the meanings behind sexual behavior, so the sexual acts themselves, are very culturally specific, meaning that what people think of these acts and meaning behind them, as well as even the social taboo around certain sexual acts, there's a wide variety and a huge variation between cultures and around the world. And you can't really sort of think that everyone has the same ideas about sex and the sexual acts that you do. And in fact, there's a lot of variation. And they're also very culturally specific. It's important, therefore, to say that, orientation and sexual activity may not correlate. Meaning, again, sexual orientation, the identity, may not correlate to the sexual activity, or that the sexual activity may not correlate to a sexual orientation. There has been many cultures around the world that practice what we would consider same-sex sexual activity. So persons of the same sex having whatever sort of sexual act with each other. And, it's easy from a Western perspective to look at that and be like, oh, these guys must be gay because they're having some sort of sexual act with each other. But gay is an identity category that would not be recognized or maybe even heavily resisted in these communities because it's not about your orientation, but it's just a sex act. And in fact, many of the people who do practice same-sex sexual activities also marry and raise children. So it's, again, very culturally specific, and you need to be very careful when you're talking about sexual behavior and acts to not sort of put a Western identity category on those acts, because most likely it's not going to correlate, or it could be very sort of, I would say, misrepresenting that community. So again, homosexuality, heterosexuality, bisexuality, and asexuality are Western specific terms and cannot be applied universally. So gay, straight, bi, those are very much terms used in North America and Europe, and they have been spread through globalization. So there are now a spread of, there is this new rise of international gay identity and gay prides. But again, as somebody who's studying these communities, you have to be very careful on the labels that you use, and you need to really look at how that community is talking about sexual behavior or act, and how that community is talking about identity. So let's get into the key terms. First one is sex, which refers to a person's biological status. Sexual dimorphism, the differences in male and female biology. Gender, the range of physical, biological, mental, behavior characteristics pertaining to and differentiating between masculinity and femininity. Gender roles, tasks, activities, and behavior or culture assigned by gender. Gender stereotypes, oversimplified but strongly held ideas about the characteristics of males and females. Gender binary, having only two genders in a culture, forcing individuals to fit into one gender category or the other. Additional key terms. Gender identity refers to whether a person feels and is regarded by others as male, female, or something else. Transgender, individuals whose gender identity contradicts their biological sex at birth and the gender identity that society assigns them in infancy. Sexual orientation refers to a person's sexual attraction to and habitual sexual activities with another person. And then sexual activity, the sex act or the sexual behavior. All right, thank you so much.